Thank you all for showing your interest. I'll spend maybe just a minute introducing myself and Bain, the company that I work for, and then probably just spend a little bit of time just going through a few prepared materials that we have, and then if we have time, I think turn it over to group discussion. We have tables, and I hope everybody's found themselves a table. I know that there are one or two tables where, for example, there's only one person, so might be a good idea to just, if you're at a very stacked table, to potentially reinforce and go through a few discussion topics. But as mentioned, the topic that we're about to cover is a pretty big and broad one. It's very hard to do it justice in 45 minutes. But quickly on Bain and Company. Sorry, I'm here on this side. It's just there's this pillar that happens to be right in the middle of the room. But Bain and Company is a consulting firm. It's a global consulting firm. We have I think 5,000 people around the world, and we focus on mostly on for-profit clients. But we also have a very sizable and very important part of our focus is actually on social impact work. And that takes a few forms. That takes things like pro bono consulting, volunteering activity. It takes the form of relationships that we have with global partners and local partners in each and every one of our offices. So for example, we're Endeavor's global partner in terms of mapping out their global strategy. We work with them across a number of countries. So some of you may know who Endeavor is. It's a very, very well-known organization which focuses on entrepreneurship, impact entrepreneurship in places and countries and markets where they feel that entrepreneurs and backing entrepreneurs is the best way to drive economic development at a country level. And so, we work with them very closely. We just work with them closely in Indonesia. But at the same time, we also have local partners that are in even more local context. One of the partners that we work with, for example, and I'm just putting it out as an example because it's relevant to the leadership topic, is CNPL, the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, with whom Bain has had a relationship for several years, and different types of collaboration. One of which is executive training sessions for executive directors and leadership teams of nonprofits, where we try and bring in some of our consulting toolkit to help tackle and bring perspectives on topics like strategy, organization, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but just so you know why I'm here and why on earth I would be here speaking to you, of all people. So what I intend to do, as I said, is go through a few pages, which many of you, well, I think everybody has in front of them a few pages, which I think are just a little bit of context setting for the topic that we're about to cover. And then after that, I'm hoping that we will have time to turn it over so that there is group discussion at the tables. And if we have time, because we really don't have a lot of time, but if we do, then to see if we have time to actually play back at least a few of the tables in terms of what experiences or what best practices you have put down in terms of some of the topics that we'll cover. So first of all, I think the thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was, our talent leadership and succession major challenges to Singapore's nonprofit sector today. I think our point of view is that is definitely the case. There's a reason why, for example, we work with an organization like CNPL because, from what we've seen in this sector, we do believe that to be the case. A few summary thoughts. One is that, let's remember that the landscape for charities and nonprofits in this country plays a very, very important role. And in fact, in many ways, it's characteristic of Singapore that actually the government expects the nonprofit sector to play quite a heavy role, and in many ways actually collaborates heavily and funds the nonprofit sector in doing so. Um, and so, it's quite large, more than 2,000 charities. Total receipts is quite big as well. If you compare that to other markets, it's not small for the size of the country that Singapore is. But if you look at some of the indicators, you'll see that there's definitely headroom to fully maximize the impact further. Just a few examples. One is that private participation could be ramped up, to be frank. Now, one of the things that we think about and why we find that relevant is that if you don't have private participation at times, there has to be reasons for it. And one of the reasons that we would argue for it is that the need for leadership and stronger and deeper leadership in the sector will actually attract more private participation, which is very, very important for the sector to make sure that it's sustainable and stands on its own 2 feet going forward. A second thing is that it is dominated in some ways by relatively few large charities. And what of course we want to see in any thriving charity sector is you want to see a large base of pretty good sized and healthy charities. And there might be more that can be done there. And the third thing is that not all the segments are progressing at the same rate. One of the things that's characteristic of Singapore is a lot of funding going into education, which is of course incredibly important. But you want to make sure that certain other segments do not actually fall behind, like health, for example. And I think the topic of leadership, succession, and the like are actually extremely relevant and important to making all those things happen. So on that topic, and we'll get to that in a second, we will actually talk a little bit about something that I think some of you have heard of. We ran this survey in conjunction with the CNPL a couple of years ago. Actually, it's more than 3 years ago. And in fact, we want to do a bigger and better version of it in the coming months with charities in the sector, where we asked them about their challenges, their aspirations, what they felt they do well, what they felt they could do better. And this is one of the topics that came up pretty strongly, that in many ways, charities here felt very strongly about themselves and their capabilities in many dimensions. But on the talent and the leadership and the board renewal front, that was the most yawning concern that actually came out of the survey. And if it happens to be different this year, that's great. Then that means basically I gave you a completely irrelevant talk. But my suspicion is that those issues remain. So we'll come to that in a second. I'll go through a few context pages. Look quickly here, the way you should read this chart, by the way, sorry, I mean as a consultant, you're going to see much more data than you would like. But the way you should read this chart is that's basically like a square pie chart, okay? Essentially 2,130 plus 580, that's the total number of organizations. Most of them are registered charities. Among the registered charities, about 60% are religious and others. And so that's the breakdown that you see. Most important thing is, look, it's a big sector. It's a very important sector. And if you think about private activity, donating and volunteering activity have been rising through the years. You might not say that means that it's sort of at its full potential in terms of participation by the average corporate or by the average individual, but at least the trend is upwards. And the overall number of charities has also increased in the recent years, right? So in many ways, you're seeing a growth story that you would expect to see in a sector like this in the country. Finally, tax-deductible donations have also started to grow again. And they dipped in 2008 for, pretty understandable reasons, considering, where the global economy was actually headed as well, right? So those are good things, right? As I said, a few indicators that we do need to step back and say, do we feel happy about these, or do we feel that there's more that actually can be done here to maximize the potential of the charity sector? And as I said, one is the continued high reliance on public funds. And we have to be very, very careful, right? It's very hard to compare between country and country, right? you don't necessarily want to compare, let's say, a Scandinavian country with the U.S. market because of differences in terms of the role of the government, in terms of public funding, tax rates, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's very hard to escape the feeling that private participation and involvement can increase. The second thing is, as I said, dominance of a relatively small number of large charities. And the third is, as I said, it's the distribution of the funding and the importance of making sure that no segments actually end up falling behind because they're not getting as much attention as they deserve. First thing is in terms of private participation. So public grants are very important in the sector, right? If you look at that chart on the left-hand side, you will see that this is total receipts, right? So this is not just grants. But if you look at the grants, you'll see that that government grants versus donations by, let's say, companies, individuals, it far outstrips the private. And as I said, I don't want to oversimplify the picture. The truth of the matter is, in many ways, the public agencies and the government recognizes and wants the nonprofit sector to grow, and so that's part of the reason why there's a lot of money funneled in, right? The question here is more on what can be done to raise that dark gray element. And I think one of the answers, is, and we'll come to this, is convincing people and corporates and companies that you have a strong leadership, that you have a strong rational board renewal process, and the like. If you look at this, this is actually the World Giving Index. Some of you may be familiar with this. It just came out recently, the latest version of this. Good thing is that Singapore has risen in the last year. The bad news is that Singapore is not particularly close to the top, right? The way that they think about this survey, by the way, is, and that's why it's one of those things you have to be very careful. You don't necessarily take the percentages that you see here and apply them and try and compare them to the first page or a couple pages that I showed you on donating and volunteering activity, because they tend to do this through their own surveys. Is very simply, they basically ask in the last month, and they survey a set of people whether they donated money to an organization, they volunteered time, or they helped a stranger, right? I mean, helping a stranger, I think, is perhaps a little bit not so particularly linked to the nonprofit sector in general, but the idea is if you take the average of each, you get the country score. So I think the idea here is, it looks like on a number of different dimensions as if private participation, whether you're talking about people who are sitting in their companies or employers, or who are actually part of just normal society, can afford to actually, or could actually go further. So how do you make that happen? The second point is dominance of large charities, as I said. Now, without going into all the detail here, I would just perhaps focus you on the right-hand side, where there's and this is a pretty standard definition used, where you take very large charities. Naturally, you expect very large charities, because they're very large, to be having more funds. The question is whether that distribution could be a little bit less skewed. So that's one thing. The second, as I said, was education sector is actually very, very important in terms of its role or the amount of receipts it receives. And this is in part reflective of the importance of the education sector and the importance it's given in this country. But also it just raises the question here as to what more could be done, and how do we make sure that others don't actually fall behind here. Here's another one of those charts which my initial explanation probably still didn't help you understand the chart. But the point here is that look at the overall size of the receipt breakdown here, and you'll see that education right there in the middle basically dominates it. The red portion there is government. and the dark gray portion is other receipts. The light gray is donations, right? So it's not uniform. That's the thing. It's very different. It's not like you can just say, okay, there's 11 billion of receipts, and that's it. That's the end of the story. It's not really quite that simple. So I'll move past this one just to show where the growth is actually happening. Basically, with this one, education there in terms of that CAGR, which is the compound annual growth rate of donations, is actually growing faster than some of the other segments as well. And interestingly, things like community and health actually, over the course of 2 years or so, actually did not get bigger at all, right? They actually became a little bit smaller. So that was just a little bit of context setting. I think the idea here is what's going on in terms of what do the charities or the NPOs tell us about why they feel, or what is it they feel that are challenges to them actually raising those funds that they need and performing as well as they actually can. And that's where the whole topic of talent and leadership and succession came out. So I'll walk you through one or two, maybe more than one or two, but a few pages from the survey that we actually did. But I'll also show you a little bit of other data that we've gathered from some other reports just to round this out. You know, this isn't all just necessarily based on survey of a few NPOs. Okay, so how do you think about, how should you read this one? Okay, the way that you should think about this is as follows. We have Bain several years ago incubated a company called Bridgespan, which is not super active here, but is probably one of the most prominent not-for-profit consulting firms for not-for-profit. So Bridgespan was incubated by Bain. Bain and Bridgespan still have a very close relationship, and we share a lot of our insights. Bridgespan has a database, as you'll see that little small print up top, which is a worldwide nonprofit organization database, whereby they've run surveys of nonprofits. And they've run pretty detailed surveys. This is just a synthesis of the survey. And basically, it's the synthesis of a few questions which relate to the categories down the left. So for example, there's a number of questions on clarity. You ask management teams or leaders in nonprofit organizations about the clarity of their vision. You ask them about questions related to the alignment of their team. By the way, some of these questions are very similar to the ones we ask in similar organization surveys for our for-profit clients. I've done this for semiconductor companies. I've done this for securities brokerage. But it's still relevant, right? Decision-making, structure, talent, etc. Now, the important thing to take out of this is that when we compared the last time around, we did this survey in Singapore, and we compared to our worldwide database of nonprofits. We found that if you look at that talent bar, that talent line, that basically this is where the Singapore nonprofits obviously felt their big pain point. And it's a big difference, right, to average. And the interesting thing was culture is a little bit harder. Like that one is a little bit harder to sort of put your finger on what's going on. To some degree, it can be linked to talent, right? Because having enough people and having a depth of people actually helps to sort of inculcate the kind of culture that you're looking for. But in some ways, Singapore nonprofits felt they were ahead in terms of, for example, their clarity of their vision and how compelling they felt their vision was. So that was quite striking, right? Because it was like just one or two areas where the gap suddenly sort of just opened very, very wide. If you look below the surface at some of these results, what you'll see is when we ask people the specific questions, and these are the questions that sort of funnel up into that synthesis that I showed you earlier. We asked them whether they strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree on a few things. what you'll find is that if you look at how compelling the vision is and the intended impact, etc., you'll find that actually people here actually came back and felt very, very strongly that this was an asset. So that wasn't the big issue. Talent was the big issue, and one of the things that came out, and so this is a little bit more detail behind the talent questions, was it's not the problem. The problem is not putting the right people in the right job. So when I have the right people, I put them in the right job, right? The problem is actually more on retaining and attracting high quality employees. And this is one of those things where the data says one thing, and anecdotally, I'm sure many of you will have had discussions, or even for some of you in your own organizations will have felt this before, because whenever we have discussions with people in the sector, we always hear this, right? And this is a specific issue that we hear in Singapore. Like if you go to a place as nearby as Hong Kong, you will not hear it in this as such a strong pain point. And there are reasons behind that, right? But that was striking. I think if you link that to where do NPOs feel they have resource gaps, truth is it's across the board, but the biggest really are fundraising and strategic planning. And that goes back to the whole point, right? I mean, how are you going to go about raising private funds to do all the things that you want to do and make your intended impact if you don't feel that you have the resources and the talent to actually make that happen, right? So it's a tough one, right? Because it ends up being a circle in a way, and so you have to find a way to break that. NPOs also felt that corporates can help. Again, mostly greens and dark greens, basically saying that they thought that corporates could help in a number of different ways, right? Okay, then the other thing is leadership and succession. So this was an interesting one, right? The reason why you see these questions here is that they tend to be related. Oftentimes we find that the answers are somewhat related to each other. But in this situation, what actually came out was very few issues in terms of things like communicating effectively, leadership who are coherent and aligned, leadership who inspire the people. But succession was really the big issue, right? So that's another clue as to what people actually found was potentially hurting them. Moving away from the survey and to another study that was actually done. A lot of this extends to the board as well, and to the capabilities that are on the board. And in many ways, you'll find that skill sets such as fundraising are still felt to be lacked on certain boards. And then another really interesting one was, how do board members actually join, right? So this is the whole topic of succession. What's your pipeline? How do you actually bring about renewal and change and revitalization in your boards, which is important in any and every board. It doesn't matter. In the for-profit sector, it's equally important, right? You don't want boards that get tired and stale because people have been on it. The entire board has been incumbent for 12 years, right? The thing that you find is that in many cases, in this case, 92% basically came back and said that 92% of us use the method of recommendation, which is good. That's fine, right? The thing is, to have that so dramatically ahead of the other ones is one of those things you sort of stop and think about here, right? I mean, you want to be able to spread the net. You want to attract the best people to your board, right? Now, if I'm sitting on a board and the best I can do is, look at my phone contact list or my Facebook page and find 25 other like-minded people like me, I'm not sure I'm going to be doing much in terms of board renewal, right? I'm not sure I'm going to be bringing new ideas onto the board. So another topic of concern, I think. And this is just related to that. It's one of those things. The average board tenure is 5.5 years based on this study that was actually done. And some board members hold 2 or more board positions, but I don't think we need to get too caught up in that. That's not, there's no need to start enacting laws saying that you can't hold more than one board position. But I think the idea here is that, board renewal and board revitalization is somewhat linked to the fact that board tenure as well. So it's just another data point. Another thing is, and this is, you might argue that this is a little bit of a tangent, but in some ways it's actually related, which is, what about disclosure? What is it that actually makes somebody decide to donate funds? If I'm sitting at home and I decide to donate funds because I'm doing a little bit of research on the internet and I decide that I want to donate to a certain cause, and I'm trying to figure out which organization I can do that with, I rely on disclosure. Right? It seems so obvious, right? I rely on information and disclosure. I'm going to go to a website and I'm going to find out. I would love to know who exactly is running this nonprofit organization. Who's on the board of this nonprofit organization? Everybody wants to know that their funds are going to be used the way that they would expect them to be used. And just because Singapore is a country that is basically free of corruption does not mean that that you don't have to provide a baseline of information. And one of the things that that needs to be done is to make sure that the leadership provides sufficient information about themselves and their qualifications and their boards in terms of not only their websites or their documentation, but all their outreach. And so, we would argue that this is somewhat related to this. So, I just wanted to give that context, and I'm sorry that I went through it quite quickly, but we don't have a lot of time, and I did want to save a little bit of time for group discussion. I hope that none of this is super controversial, because in many ways I feel like anecdotally these are the types of things that we hear on a day-to-day basis. The thing that I would like is perhaps in the few minutes that we have left to do this is for the groups at the tables to actually start doing some internal discussion and experience sharing and best practices on a few points, because clearly we and I don't have all the answers here, and the intention of this was not actually to tell you exactly how to go about doing this, because I think frankly the best ideas come from the leaders of the organizations themselves. What I'm hoping is that if we think about this as a few must-haves, one is a strategy for talent attraction and retention in the face of competition. It's not just talking about competition from charities. I'm talking about competition from the for-profit sector, right? For example, a structured approach to board revitalization and succession. So basically, structured succession process. The third is a strategy to attract the right partners, such as corporates. Is that especially when we have leadership issues and leadership crunch? Do we have the alternative? Do we have a way to actually augment our resources by attracting partners, such as consulting firms? And then finally, commitment to transparent, high-quality disclosure. So if we take this page as just a starter, right, what I would propose is if each table, and if you think about it this way, is maybe the two tables here can just focus on the first point there, and really it's all about just experience sharing, putting down what you would agree are some of the best practices, so that we can sort of speak them out and make sure that if there are important learnings and best practices, that we can all sort of go away, take them away. Me, Bain and company can go and take them away, and the next time I have a pro bono session or a training session with NPOs, that I can actually say something sensible for once, right? The second topic, if perhaps these two tables could take, which is the board succession and renewal. The third topic, perhaps those two, and the fourth topic, let's put it this way, right? Because I think the topic on board succession and renewal is a really hot one. So maybe this table, and this table, tackle that, and then finally the two tables at the end tackle the fourth topic. If we were to take, well, we don't have a lot of time, 15 minutes to discuss best practices and try and put them down, and then even less time to actually play them back, then I think we're, so basically I think it's 2:27. Sorry to be extremely extremely strict about this, but let's try and do this by 2:42. Was just hoping that, and I know these discussions between participants will continue in the next, after this, but I was just hoping that we could maybe just pick on one or a few of the tables here on each of the topics. I don't think that any of these issues have been cracked entirely just through a 15-minute conversation, but just to share perhaps some of the ideas and thoughts that you came out with. Frankly, it's more for my own selfish purposes to be able to take mental notes for myself so I can replay them back and sound smart. So perhaps we can start with the topic of the first kind of big, huge topic, and see if there are some of the takeaways out of the many that you've discussed that you might be able to just shoot out and share with us.
Okay, just to summarize a few key points that were discussed. I think the first point is that if the organization has a very clear and compelling vision and mission, it's a lot easier to convince people to actually join the organization and basically commit to to achieving that vision and mission, despite the fact that I think we know the reality is that, because in terms of remuneration, we will never be able to compare against what they could be earning, say, in the private sector. So that's one thing. Another thing that someone in the table here has shared in terms of their experiences that was very successful is in re-looking how you redesign all the job roles and responsibilities among individuals. So basically to try to recraft their job roles to suit their individual personal preferences. Right, so some people, they may prefer to, instead of doing like 5 things, they may actually only really like doing 3 things, and then you let them focus on doing those things, and they will actually increase their morale and a lot easier to attract them to stay. And yes, I think this some of
the. Okay. What about the second topic? It's hard. There's a million things you can actually come out with. So getting put on the spot for 2 or 3 things it's hard to find the 2 or 3 things. But if you were to pick a few, what would you come up with, Eunice?
Our group here discussed that, but we found that, among my new group of friends here, and I say friends because I just made friends here. And most of us don't have a very structured roadmap, but we try to share our best practices, all our practices, and I share some of this. Hina here from Island Foundation shared with us that with them, their board, all right, for people who are not able to come forward, all right, because they don't have the experience, but they're nevertheless interested, and yet they don't want to invest too much time and so on. Then what they have done is a very, very good practice, which I thought is great. And that's, they have advisory panels and members so that these people can come on board and be groomed into it. But what they do is they focus on programs, and start with that area. And then later they can perhaps be interested to be board members. That's one of the areas. For others, for example, sorry, I didn't get your name. Cynthia. Now, Cynthia is in a grant-making position in an organization. They have a very small board, but they have got policies and roles of the board written clearly. And I think that's another area where when you do that, you can also, have a much more structured approach to the board, how you want, your board to contribute and do its work. And again, look at how you can expand perhaps later if need be, and revitalize it as you go along. And sorry, I didn't get all their names because we were so busy trying to meet the timeline. Freddie from Morning Star, all right, shared other areas, and one of them was that they don't have a structured approach, but their board size at 11 board members. By the way, he's from Morningstar, a community-based organization, and for them, retaining the board size was fine. Revitalizing it was not so easy, because what they did was they don't have a tenure for board members, but what they have is a tenure for each role. Yeah, so they rotate them, all right, and try to revitalize. But he said the challenge is sometimes they can be there so long that they are rotating round and round, all right, and that's what it is. So the good and the bad of it is also there, which he shared, and I think that's relevant. And then we have, sorry, I didn't get your name. Go from Mercy Relief. We all have heard of that now. That's a huge organization that has grown from a more faith-based one, and today it's much more secular. It's almost multiracial, multi-religious, and doing a lot of good work. Again, he shared with us, they have got a very good big board, but again, their challenge to revitalize it is that people stay for a long time, and sometimes ideas are very set, and so that is the part and the challenge. I think for ourselves here, I'm from Tan Tock Seng Hospital Community Charity Fund. We started also with a big challenge in that, because the charity sector suffered a few scandals, and they were all in the health sector, if you recall. And a hospital is definitely in the health sector. And for that, we suffered along with the organizations that had the scandals. And so attracting board members and trying to revitalize, or even attract them to get them in, was already hard work. Talk about revitalizing. So we started off with 3, and we've gone on to 5, all right? But we are now much more stable. What we do is we look at how we are going and what sort of people can come in and add value. So for example, when we felt that we need legal, all right, and then we went out to, scout for one. How do we do this? We get our board members. By the way, my board members, the independent ones, are all from commercial organizations. So through them, through their contacts, we look at people from other boards. And of course, these people have quite a wide network. So we actually invite them to come in and join us. And that's how we go. All right? I think that's about all I have to share. And that's how each of us, do it in our own way.
That's very interesting. Very friendly people that tend to make friends before we even know each other's names. Great. Okay. That's a big topic. Right? In fact, the first 2 are big topics, arguably more complex than maybe the third one. But I think the third one is still very important as well. So I'm going to ask somebody at this table to volunteer a few thoughts. Our Rose.
I thought I had the advantage. Okay, I'm Jenny from Shanyu Counseling Center. So we were discussing about collaboration, getting support from corporates or our partners. I think we have this common challenge that many of the corporates or the fund, the grant makers that we approach already have their kind of what do you call, programs or certain segment that they have already decided upon. That means, for example, if they decide to fund education, so if you go for something else, they will say that, oh no, we have our favorite charities that we will support. Or sometimes they may say that, okay, we do not have a budget for that. So, and we feel that maybe NCSS could help us by setting up some kind of a matching registry that they can say, okay, these charities, are for these things, and funders may look at us and say, okay, now I can go to where I can go and support. And I think the other challenge we have is that the charities that we represent, for example, Action for AIDS, and for example, in our case, counseling, dealing with mental health and certain illness may not be having such great support. For example, just now our lady here from Tan Tock Seng says, why hospitals get a lot of funding and maybe because of that get into some scandals as well. For example, like in our case, because she mentioned about hospitals, right? Healthcare. I think people can relate to physical illness more easily than mental health, mental illness. And I think here we shared the feeling that those people having mental illness are being isolated. People do not really interact so much with them. So because of that, maybe the awareness is lower and getting support is a little bit more difficult. So I think this is how we feel, and therefore we feel that maybe some sharing of information will be helpful. Yeah? Anything else to add?
I've been asked to clarify the. I'm pretty sure we all understand that it's. Don't worry about it. But go ahead.
Now, a dear rose among thorns. No, seriously. I did not say what you interpreted. I think all of them heard what I said, and that is that when the scandals happened, it happened in the health sector. It didn't, right? And it's not because it got so much money, that's why it went. It was because some other people did not correctly interpret the usage of money. And that was not in my organization, right? Yeah. But my poor Tan Tock Seng got dragged into it. Anyway, seriously, by the way, if you are looking at mental health, even in Tan Tock Seng, well, my charity runs 70 over programs. It does include that mental health bit too, right? Gosh, I've invited something else.
Okay. It's good. I knew it was only a matter of time before and somebody said NCSS needs to do something to help us out. But it's a good idea. Okay, final point. No? James? Sorry, who's James? Oh, James.
I speak on behalf of the group. James from Singapore Association for Mental Health. Actually, when we looked at number 4, we were not sure whether we were looking at the board or whether we were looking at senior management staff. But our discussion centered mainly on board. And we said it's exceptionally important for the board to know their roles before you get a commitment. And very often there's some vague idea about board roles and senior management roles, and the two get mixed up quite a bit. So we said that it's very important to first be very clear about the profile of board members that we need for each organization. At least half of those should be really people with that professional expertise, like mental health, for example. You should get psychiatrists and counselors and so on and so forth. But of course, you need others like legal expertise, HR, finance, IT sort of people. And how do we get them? Various sources, I suppose. You can get them from CNPL and from places like that. And I think it's very important amongst the board members themselves to identify which areas, are in need of support depending on the strategies of the organization. And they can either get these new members from CNPL or from their own referrals, but there still has to be a selection process. I think it still should have stringent, requirements, and they should, be invited to the organization to look at what you're doing and all that, so that you get the right person for the right job, and the fit is good. The commitment is very important because, for every organization, you do need people who are prepared to stay. And we did say that for the next year, for the next 2 years, even for senior management staff, because there are more jobs chasing after people, it's very important to try to get them to grow roots. So getting them to know and appreciate your vision and mission is exceptionally important. We said the roles of the board members can be disclosed, in your annual report. Your governance has got so many questions. Have you met this, that, and the other? You got to truthfully answer that, of course, And we said the role of the board members must be very clear, and that's really in terms of strategic planning. And they shouldn't really get too involved in the nitty-gritty of daily operations, and that they, through their network, hopefully, will be able to ensure donations come in, that there's financial health, and that, through their own networks, they can do so much more for the organization. Anything else there? That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. So, these are pretty big topics, and I'm glad that we got the chance to exchange a few views. I took a few notes for myself as well, so I learned quite a bit as well myself. So, thank you for allowing me to facilitate this session with you all today. Thank you.